And today, I am very pleased to archaeologist James Dixon. Dr. Dixon received his bachelor's and master's from the University of Alaska and his PhD from Brown University. He was a Marshall Fellow for Research at the National Museum of Denmark and a professor and curator at the University of Alaska until 1993, when he became curator of archaeology at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. In 2001, he was appointed professor of anthropology and a research fellow at the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research at the University of Colorado, and since 2007, he has served as professor of anthropology and director of the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology at the University of New Mexico. His most recent book, Arrows and Atlatls, provides an overview of cultural development over the regions of Alaska, Russia, and Canada, known today as Beringia. And I can tell you it's a very good read, and it synthesizes a lot of data. The maps and charts are very well done, and I found them to be particularly helpful. He also put together a section of profiles and photos of Arctic archaeologists. That's a nice tribute to the giants who came before us, and it puts faces to many names in Arctic archaeology. I particularly appreciated the profiles of our Russian colleagues, because unless you've met them, you very rarely see pictures of our foreign researchers. Arrows and Atlatls was published by the National Park Service, by the way, so it should be available to everyone. And this year, Dr. Dixon was appointed to the National Science Foundation Advisory Committee on Geosciences that administers, among others, the Division of Polar Programs. And he has extensive experience in research on human colonization, high-altitude and high-latitude human adaptations, and early cultural development of the Americas, and he will draw on that knowledge for his talk today. From Asia to the Americas, late Ice Age colonization corridors examines recent research on the peopling of the New World, including a maritime route along the western coast of North America. It looks like you're on and you're ready to go. So thank you for joining us today. I'm sorry that it was a little bit more exciting than it needed to be, Jim.
Oh, no problem, Karen. Thank you very much for that nice introduction. It's very kind of you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you fine. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Yes, I'd like to start in today by providing a broad overview of the peopling of the Americas, and then kind of drill down on the northwest coast area of North America, which in recent years has emerged as a very viable alternative hypothesis for the peopling of the Americas. And are my slides coming up, and is everyone able to see the first one of the African savanna?
Yes.
Oh, very good. As all of you know probably, and just to kind of give a big picture here and then start to drill in on the local area, humans evolved in Africa and spread from Africa out into Eurasia and then ultimately to the Americas. And when one looks at the colonization of the Americas, I think that most of the archaeological evidence suggests that this occurred during the Pleistocene, during the last glacial episode in North America. And if you look at it from a polar perspective, which you can see in this illustration, there are really only five viable hypotheses in terms of routes to the Americas. One, of course, is from Asia across the Bering Land Bridge into North America, a continental route. Another is along the southern margins of the Bering Land Bridge and down the west coast of the Americas. Then, of course, in recent years, my colleague and friend Dennis Stanford has proposed what he calls the Solutrean hypothesis, which suggests that late Ice Age people may have been able to colonize the Americas by skirting the ice fringe, the polar ice cap, along the North Atlantic with the use of watercraft, and then reach the American continent that way. And then finally, and these have been around for hundreds of years, transoceanic hypothesis, where people may have crossed the Atlantic or the broader expanses of the Atlantic and Pacific to reach the Americas. So what I'd like to do today is really focus on the two routes which I think are most talked about in North America, and one is the mid-continental route, and another is along the North Pacific of North America. During the height of the last glaciation, about 18,000 radiocarbon years ago, roughly, North America and Asia were connected by a land bridge. We call it the Bering Land Bridge, but really it was a very broad expanse of the continental shelf, more than 1,000 kilometers wide from north to south. The Bering and Chukchi Seas are very shallow, and when glaciers were at their height during the last ice age, sea level was lower by about almost 200 meters, not quite, and this exposed the broad plains stretching between Northeast Asia and Alaska, connecting both North America and Asia, and they were essentially one continent at that point in time. If you look at this slide, you can see the lighter green area denotes the continental shelf. This is area that's all underwater today as part of the Pacific and Arctic Oceans. The darker green areas on your left, the viewer's left, is Chukotka, northeast Siberia, and on the right is Alaska, which is the northwestern extreme of North America. So this will give you an idea of how the two continents were interrelated. And of course, the standard paradigm has been for many years, probably more than 100 years, that people first came from Asia to North America via this route. Let's see, yes. And as sea level rose over time, the continental shelves gradually flooded, sea level rising, and here's a sequence from the upper left to the lower right of sea level rise at the end of the last ice age. Beginning about 15,000 years ago, you can see that sea level was about 88 meters below its present level. And if you look at this slide, you can see that what emerges here is a vast and very complex archipelago along the southern part of the Bering Land Bridge. Some people have hypothesized this might have been a very productive environment for marine mammals, fisheries, shellfish, and so forth, and that the coast, the southern coast of the land bridge, may have been a very viable route for people to follow into the Americas. Certainly, we have people in northern Japan and adjacent parts of Asia that are living on islands and appear to be maritime adapted very early. And so one hypothesis is that people would have spread along the east coast of Asia, northward, along the southern margins of the Bering Land Bridge, through the Gulf of Alaska, and then south into the Americas. And you can see from this depiction here that this southern margin was certainly viable both ecologically and in terms of glaciation, which I'll talk more about here as we move forward. The standard paradigm is that Ice Age hunters were in Asia, hunting mammoths and so forth, crossed the Bering Land Bridge when sea level was lower during the last Ice Age, then moved south, allegedly through a hypothesized ice-free corridor into the continental United States, areas south of the continental glaciers, and where they continued hunting mammoths, large Pleistocene animals, and were the first colonists of the Americas. However, you can see from this reconstruction of the glacial limits during the height of the last ice age, about 18,000 years ago, that there is no ice-free corridor. There never was during the last glacial maximum, and if you trace this back in the literature, it really starts in the 1930s when a geologist, W.A. Johnson, suggested that there may have been, and I've actually read his original publication, and that's all he says, there may have been an ice-free corridor, and I think he offered that to explain the fact that people were south of the continental glaciers at that time. Since then, we've realized that this is not the case. There never was an ice-free corridor, but as the ice melted, a deglaciation corridor appeared. So if I had my preference, I would say that we should drop the term ice-free corridor altogether and refer to the deglaciation corridor that emerges later in time as such, and not refer to it as ice-free corridor. Let's see here. Oh yes, I didn't keep up with my slides. This is so as people got south of the ice, there was good evidence that began to emerge in the 1930s that humans had hunted Pleistocene fauna, mammoths. This is a photo of the famous Dent site where Clovis points and artifacts were, and mammoth remains were first found in association. Here's a slide of the Clovis points that were actually found at the Dent site, and I just love this photo of everyone excavating there because I love the way these guys are wearing their ties and their hats and their suits, and they're on the dirt going at it. Very formal excavations. But it wasn't named after these original artifacts weren't fully accepted at the time because the investigators had some concerns that they might not be associated. There might be some questions of redeposition or other geologic factors that may have disturbed the site, so they did not fully name it and accept it, and it wasn't until the subsequent Clovis discovery that it became widely recognized as Clovis. So the idea is that people came through this southward from Beringia through the ice-free corridor, and here we have this wonderful portrayal. It's a little faded in this slide of an artist's conception of what this migration may have looked like. And when they got south of the ice, of course, they encountered a suite of Pleistocene fauna that were very similar to those that were existing in Alaska and in Asia, and that this was a very uniform environment and adaptive strategy for early Paleo-Americans. And here's just a gratuitous slide of Clovis projectile points. However, as time has gone on and we've examined this very simple and straightforward model of hunters coming across the Bering Land Bridge, bearing this Clovis-type technology down through an ice-free corridor, and then encountering the Pleistocene fauna of North America, we've realized that this situation the archaeological picture is far more complex. We have a number of archaeological sites in Alaska now that date to about 14,000 calendar years before present. This is well before a deglaciation corridor emerges in the central continent. And the artifacts associated with these very early sites are quite different than Clovis. They're very different. They are these Eurasian microblade traditions. These are pictures of microblade cores from the Swan Point site, very well stratified archaeological site in eastern Beringia, which is now Alaska, that date to about 14,000 years ago. And you can see that this technology, this entire approach to environmental adaptation is very different than Clovis. Clovis lacks microblades. They both have blades or blade-like flakes, but the bifacial technology is quite different, and the microblade technology is entirely absent from Clovis. So there really is a marked difference between these eastern Beringian, early eastern Beringian microblade traditions about 14,000 years ago, and Clovis that first appears south of the continental glaciers more than 1,000 years later, almost 2,000 years later. So this is another depiction, and I should say that these illustrations are from an article in Quaternary International that I published a few years ago, showing the deglaciation sequence. And what is unique about these is that they both incorporate the Bering Land Bridge, the flooding of the Bering Land Bridge over time, along with the deglaciation of North America, so that you can see the relationship of the land connection between Asia and North America and the land connection between eastern Beringia, what's now Alaska, and the Canadian Yukon, and the areas south of the continental glaciers. So by about 16,000 calendar years ago, you can see that there's starting to form in central Canada or western Canada a deglaciation corridor. It's certainly not open, and there's vast areas of ice still blocking access from between eastern Beringia and what Alaskans would call the lower 48. But if you look at the northwest coast of North America, you can see that the northwest coast is ice-free by this time. So this is a very important fact in looking at possible migration corridors. Just to assure you, and I know you don't have to read this whole thing, but just to assure you, these aren't just pretty maps that Jim Dixon created on the back of an envelope or something. They're really based on a very rigorous review of the glacial mapping for both Canada and the United States, and it's quite clear that this accurate mapping really does reveal the sequence of deglaciation and its relationships along both the west coast of North America and the central continental areas. And these are the sources that I used to compile these maps. So we're still moving forward in time. Now we're at 15,000 years ago, and finally a deglaciation corridor has opened between eastern Beringia and the more southern areas of North America. You can see that deglaciation has progressed even further along the northwest coast of North America, but it's been thousands of years now that has been open. In fact, we know now that there were actually refugia that were not glaciated along that coast. And the research, the paleoecological research in the area of the ice-free corridor, or I would call the deglaciation corridor, really shows a very impoverished environment. There are no mammal bones dated from this time period at all. The pollen records are very sparse. Some scattered lichens, not lichen, but sedge and maybe some mosses, but it's very impoverished. By 14,000 calendar years ago, you can see that deglaciation along the northwest coast is extensive, in fact, almost to what it is today. And yet, in the central part of North America, it is still very, very narrow, a very narrow corridor, biotically impoverished. And these blue areas are actually proglacial lakes that were in the corridor area, and we can see these lakes coming and going. There have been no fish remains, anything like that found. So they appear to be glacial outwash deposits, glacially dammed lakes, a very changing and biotically impoverished environment, not conducive for human or animal colonization until a bit later. By about 13,000 calendar years ago, you can see the interior corridor is now wide. We're starting to pick up the first mammal remains and plant remains. And by about 10,300 years ago or so, we have the very radiocarbon years, so that's 12,500 calendar years. So this is about 500 years after the previous slide we just saw. The site of Charlie Lake Cave has not only archaeological remains, but bison remains as well. And the DNA of the analysis of the bison remains show that the northern bison and the southern bison have come in contact at this site by about 12,500 years ago. So probably a good date for the opening and the viability of a deglaciation corridor is about 13,000 to 12,500 years ago, somewhere in that range. And if you also look at the northwest coast, it is completely deglaciated at this point, and it has been open for colonization and migration for thousands, about at least 4,000 to 5,000 years prior to this. This is a slide of Charlie Lake Cave, courtesy of Jonathan Driver, and you can see that this is a very deeply buried, stratified site, and so the quality of the data, and it's very well excavated, quality of the data from this site is very high and reliable. At Charlie Lake Cave, we started to pick up what many people would call the northern paleoindian tradition. These basally thin, concave base projectile points. These occur in Alaska as well, and it's quite clear that now that we have dated these, both in Alaska, the Yukon Territory of Canada, and the areas of the deglaciation corridor, that they are younger than Clovis. These are very late Paleoindian types of projectile points, and it's quite clear that this technology is not coming from north to south, but south to north. What this means is that one of the things it means is that people had to live be south of the continental glaciers prior to the melting for this technology to spread northward to the deglaciation corridor. And this actually has to be a movement of people because this area was uninhabited prior to that time. It was covered by glacial ice, so this isn't diffusion or trade or something like that. It is a clear movement of people into previously unavailable territory. And we just happen to have this very rare photo of the two bison clades meeting at Charlie Lake Cave. So I would like to go back here and take another closer look at the northwest coast of North America now. We're back at 16,000 years ago. And if you'll take a look at the, let's see if I can try the cursor here, see if this will work. Can you see the cursor? Anyway, oh, very good. We have a completely deglaciated coastline all the way from Kamchatka, all along the southern coast of the Bering Land Bridge, along the Gulf of Alaska, all the way down the west coast of North America, and providing what John Erlandson has referred to as the Kelp Highway. And it's really a continuous biome from Asia to North America of seals, fish, a variety of waterfowl, marine mammals, shellfish, that is very similar from one side of the North Pacific to the other. And the idea is that people adapted to this type of ecosystem could have moved along this unoccupied coastline into the Americas thousands of years earlier than they could have by a central route. Now, this doesn't preclude, the Solutrean hypothesis or transoceanic voyaging and so forth, but it is, I think, a very plausible, in fact, probably the most plausible in my mind, hypothesis for the earliest peopling of the Americas. A little closer look at this, and you can see that the shoreline at 16,000 years ago, and we have large areas, particularly around the Queen Charlotte Islands, which is, let's see if I can get the cursor going here again, right here, this area here, along northward, Prince of Wales Island, and the continental shelf that's submerged along here as well, vast areas in here along the west coast of Mitkoff Island and so forth. These areas were refugia during the Pleistocene, and we know this because we have biological data in terms of marine mammal remains from caves. We have Arctic fox. We have some terrestrial mammals. There are even caribou remains have been recovered from Prince of Wales Island, which is right here in this on this map, that clearly demonstrate that even during the height of the last glaciation, 18,000 years ago, there were pockets of land along this coast that in which terrestrial mammals, marine mammals, fish survived during the Pleistocene. In fact, some of the pollen evidence, and I'll show a little bit of that later, also suggests that there may have been refugia for shore pine as well. So there may have been some trees along this coastline in various pockets.
Jim, can I interrupt you for just a minute?
Sure.
People that, if you want to use your computer and type during these, that's fine, but you need to mute your phone so that we can't hear you. Thanks.
Oh, I wasn't typing. I think that must be someone else.
You weren't, but someone was.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. So let's see. Where am I here? Oh, yes. So this is a photo of the coast of Greenland, and it will give you an idea of what some of the some of the coastline along the northwest coast of North America may have looked like, and during the height of the last glaciation. So there certainly were places where valley glaciers, tongues of glacial ice, came out to the ocean, but these could have easily been skirted by with the use of watercraft to the refugia on either side. This is a very closed view, but some of the refugia on the northwest coast were much larger than this, supporting brown bears and caribou and other species as well, Arctic fox. Here's a map of the northwest coast. If you look in the upper right here in this area, you'll see that the box depicts the area of the map on your screen. The red dots are various archaeological and paleontological sites where we have good evidence documenting both the paleo-environmental records and the early archaeological finds along the coast. Here's a composite pollen diagrams, or not diagrams, but stages of plant development along the northwest coast. The upper part is in the northern area, which is what we call southeast Alaska, not southeast to you, but if you're in interior Alaska, it is southeast, and British Columbia, which is immediately south along the coast. And you can see that we have very good pollen records all the way back to about 13 to 16,000 years in various places. This work is still in its early stages, but if you look at, let's say, Mitkoff Island, for example, well, you might say, oh, the record terminates at 13,000 years ago, and so it must have been glaciated at that time. Well, I think it's very important, and you could do the same thing for Pass Lake on Prince of Wales Island and so forth, but I think it's very important to keep in mind that these sites are very landward and not out on the continental shelf or the islands further to the west. So what this suggests is that these areas may have been colonized by plants a little bit later, but if you went further west, you would find similar records to what we see in British Columbia or on Pleasant Island and further seaward. The problem is that probably some of the oldest records are now underwater on the continental shelf. But clearly by about 16,000 years ago, plants are well established, and we certainly have terrestrial mammal records going back much earlier. So just to summarize the late glacial maximum archaeology and paleoecology along the northwest coast, and LGM here, right here, stands for late glacial maximum, last glacial maximum, I'm sorry. It was diachronous, which means that it didn't all happen at the same time in the same place. In the same place. So, in other words, glacial ice may have advanced a little earlier in one area, retreated a little earlier in another, and so forth. So, it's a very complex record that's going to take many, many more years to fully understand. Glaciation reached its maximum extent about between about 20 and 16,000 calendar years ago. And before I was talking about the LGM, I was using 18,000 radiocarbon years ago, but that brackets it in calendar years for you. The LGM ice conditions were severe, but there were terrestrial plants and animals that survived in refugia along the coast, and marine species such as ring seal survived in locally favorable marine environments. And the reason we know this, we actually have the fossil remains of the ring seals at the height of the last glaciation. These are a type of seal that live in further north now in the higher Arctic, so it gives an idea about the ice conditions at that time. At the end of the last glaciation, sea level rose very rapidly, and here's a graph or a chart of the late Pleistocene sea level rise, beginning about 16,000 years ago, shortly after the LGM, and you can see it's very steep and rapid. This is amazing, and it's due to a number of geologic factors. One is what's called a forebulge effect. As the glacial ice moved out from the Canadian Rocky Mountains seaward, moved westward, flowing out of the mountains toward the ocean, it produced a great deal of weight on the land, and it forced what's called a forebulge. It's like if you slid your foot along the carpet, there's a bulge of carpet rises in front of your foot. Well, it's kind of like that. So the land in front of the ice actually rose up. So the continental shelf, the extreme continental shelf of western North America, was much higher than it is today. When this load of ice was released, this forebulge collapsed and sea level rose very rapidly. And that's what we're seeing here in this graph, this very rapid rise of sea level in the period of just a few thousand years. It rises 160 meters. This makes it very difficult to, this complex geology, makes it very difficult to try to identify sites both on land and on the continental shelf that might date to this time period. Nevertheless, we've made quite a bit of progress, and this is a slide shared with me by a colleague, Daryl Fidgey, who's done quite a bit of work in British Columbia, immediately south of the area that I've been working in. And these are, this is a K1 cave. It's right up here in this area of this slide. And he and his team have worked there. And of course, they've found made a number of exciting discoveries. Here's a very large brown bear mandible. We're finding many of these bears in these caves, and along with it, the bases of two projectile points. And I just wanted to take a minute to point these out. This is the base of a projectile point. It's ground a little bit on the edges, and here's the base of another one. So you can see it's this kind of broad leaf-shaped type of form. Here are another two caves that Daryl worked at. Gagudin 1 cave is right here where this red circle is, and then Gagudin 2 is right here. And here's some of the excavations. And again, he discovered projectile points here of the same form, these big, long, leaf-shaped type points with these ovate tapering bases, as illustrated here in this slide. And the dates again are about 10,600 to 10,000 radiocarbon years. So this is Folsom in age, if you were in the more continental areas of the of North America. There we go. Another site a little bit further north, On Your Knees Cave. These are projectile points from On Your Knees Cave, and you can see again we're getting this these large leaf-shaped points. In fact, it looks a little Salutrian-like, this particular example. And the area that I'm highlighting here with the pointer are the actual projectile point bases. So this is the bottom. This is the part that halves. They're not Clovis points. They are very different, very distinctive, but they are contemporaneous. The ones, these and the ones, some of the ones that Darrell found are contemporaneous with the paleoindian tradition in the more central areas of North America. These are probably a little bit younger, but not a lot, but markedly different. There's also more stemmed varieties that occur with this, and here's two obsidian points right here that go with this. Here's the base of another one. And the idea here is that they start out as these big leaf-shaped points, very Salutrian almost looking, and then they, as they're broken and reworked, they begin to become these tapered points, very similar to the Western stem point tradition examples that maybe some of you are familiar with. Also from the same site were recovered the oldest human remains found along the northwest coast. They're about 9,730 radiocarbon years old, which is about 10,300 calendar years old. And this is in the background you see a photograph of the cast of the mandible of a young man whose remains these represent. And across the top of the chart, right along here, you see a scale of carbon-13 isotope values. On your left, as you face the slide, you will see that right here it marks terrestrial plants, animals, terrestrial feeders, let's put it that way, and on the right, marine feeders. So when we analyze specimens, animal remains and human remains, and compare them to this scale, we can tell what were the primary compositions of their diet. So on the left side of this scale here, we see we have beaver, marmot, caribou, black bear, and so forth, very terrestrial types animals. Then as we go over toward the right side, we start to get Arctic red fox. So these are probably scavenging a lot of things off the beach. We have fish, whale, and here's our human, way over here. Has a very high carbon-13 value, and this suggests that he was, doesn't suggest it, it demonstrates that he was his diet consisted largely of marine foods. And not only that, we know from the nitrogen values that aren't depicted here that he also, they are very high, and it suggests that he was eating at very highest trophic levels. In other words, he was eating marine carnivores, probably seals and maybe some salmon, so forth. If you compare the isotope values from this individual with known isotope values from other archaeological sites in the Arctic, the very top one here, the Sadler Mute, these are Inuit people from Hudson's Bay who lived on an island in Hudson's Bay. Their diet was virtually 100% marine, not 100%, but a very high marine diet, as you might expect from islanders. And you can see that the delta 13 values here are very high for both nitrogen and carbon. Here's the next one in the table here are prehistoric Aleut people. These are people that lived in the Aleutian Island chain, a treeless island chain that stretches out from the Alaska Peninsula into the North Pacific, and again, very high values. And then if you look at Shukaka, which is the Tlingit name for the individual that was recovered from On Your Knees Cave, the name picked by selected by the Tlingit people, and it means person that went before us, person ahead of us, the isotope values again are extremely high. So this clearly indicates that at this point in time, over 10,000 years ago, we have clear evidence of a marine adaptation. At this time, sea level had risen high enough that On Your Knees Cave was on an island in southeast Alaska. We see that you saw from the projectile points that there were obsidian points and exotic lithic types that could only have reached the island through the use of watercraft. The diet of the individual clearly shows a maritime adaptation, and this is very solid evidence for pre-10,000 year maritime adaptation in this part of the world, as well as the use of watercraft. It's impossible to get to these places without the use of watercraft. You can't swim to them because of the cold waters and so forth, and it just wouldn't be practical, of course, to even propose that as a hypothesis. So I think that what we're seeing here on the northwest coast is an emerging pattern of large bifacial projectile points. When I was a student, we were told that there were no bifacial tools along the northwest coast, that these people probably had either later microblade industries or flake industries, and there was no evidence of these big lancelet points. Well, of course, we're finding those now. Maritime adaptations were believed to only be a mid-Holocene development in North America. Well, now we can see clearly there are late Pleistocene and probably earlier adaptations. So these are very important evidence, and I think that the finds that we've made here, those from southern parts of the northwest coast and northern areas as well, are really the tip of the iceberg. Probably a lot of the story lies on the continental shelves that are now submerged, areas that were refugia and ice-free areas during the last glacial maximum, and of course that's one of the areas that we're going to try to look at in more detail. In fact, we've had a 3-year underwater program off of Prince of Wales Island, west of Prince of Wales Island in southeast Alaska, in searching for underwater sites with no definitive success yet, but I'm sure we can. It's possible. But returning to our theme here, what I've done here in this slide is present a sequence from left to right of the deglaciation of North America in 1,000-year time slices. So you can see at 18,000 years ago, at the height of the last glacial maximum, there is no interior route between Alaska and the southern areas of North America south of the continental ice. But even during the height of the last glaciation along the northwest coast, there are many deglaciated areas and refugia on the continental shelf that through which it may have been possible for people to enter the Americas. By 16,000 years ago, the entire coast is deglaciated and available for colonization, whereas the interior route is still closed. By 15,000 years ago, much greater area of the northwest coast is developed. We have high species diversity, plants, animals, well documented throughout the entire region, and the deglaciation corridor is just emerging, blocked in many places by large proglacial lakes, sterile of fish, and no evidence of mammal colonization. This pattern continues on through 14,000 years ago, and it's not till about 13,000 calendar years ago that the corridor becomes viable enough to support plants and animals and become a corridor for human migration. By 12,500 calendar years ago, we have Charlie Lake Cave, and we have clear evidence that bison moving from the south northward have entered the corridor, as well as bison from the north moving southward have entered the corridor, and the two genetic groups meet in this area. Bison are considered a very good proxy for habitat viability because they're highly mobile. They can move into an area quickly, and they are in great numbers, so their remains tend to be good index fossils for this type of analysis. So just to summarize here very quickly, I'd just like to compare these two scenarios. The coastal migration corridor is open and ecologically viable by about at least 3,500 years earlier than an interior glaciation corridor. And I think one could argue that it may never have been a serious impediment during the last glacial, although I think it would have been much easier and more viable beginning about 16,000 years ago. We certainly have a growing body of data for pre-Clovis sites in the Americas, and I think the consensus, professional consensus, is now overwhelming that Clovis is not first, and that people reached the Americas earlier, and one of the routes by which they may have done this is along the northwest coast. Doesn't mean that I think we need to keep our minds open to these other possibilities as well, but in my opinion, this is probably the most viable hypothesis, but they're not mutually exclusive either, and we may find that over time we have multiple origins for early American populations. And this is important in terms of our understanding of the processes of colonization and the timing of colonization. So I think that's, I raced through a lot of stuff very quickly, and I hope I haven't bored you or lost you, but I'd be more than willing to answer any questions or entertain any discussion if you have the time. Thank you very much.
Jim, thank you for a great talk. Do we have any questions or comments? Don't be shy, people.
Sounds like one of my classes.
Well, I have a question.
Sure. You're very nice.
I was very struck by the points from On Your Knees Cave and the Quadudin Cave that you showed us, and I guess I'm asking about the relationship between whether or not people have thought about the relationship between that type of technology and what we see in farther north in Beringia, and also, you know, what we see farther south in terms of Clovis points. Are people arguing that these are good technological ancestors?
No, I don't. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
For Clovis?
Well, no, I don't think that has been the case, although it's certainly a possibility. I think most of the discussion has focused on the Western stem point tradition, and I don't know if everyone's familiar with the excavations at Paisley Cave and other sites in the very far west that suggest that the Western stem point tradition is actually older than Clovis, at least equally as old, and if you accept the Paisley Cave data, dated older than Clovis. So that I think at least some of my colleagues, in fact I was just talking to someone about this yesterday, have hypothesized that the Western stem point tradition comes along the North Pacific coast, enters very early, and these points may be related to that. And I was kind of hinting at that when I was showing how, as they are reduced in size and use, those large leaf-shaped points basically evolve into stem points as they're used. So that discussion has been held. It's also possible that there may be if you will, I hate to use so many evolutionary terms, but a common ancestor for both of Clovis and these large leaf-shaped points as well. So the final story isn't in on that, but it's a very interesting question.
I have a question. This is Michael Fott. Hi, Jim.
Oh, hey, Mike. How are you?
Good. Good presentation. So are you familiar with the notion that there's a genetic standstill, they're calling it, of about 15 to 20,000 years supposedly in Beringia?
Yes, I am.
Geneticists have come. Is there an archaeological complex that we could target as that group?
Well, I think so. If one wants to do that, associate the genes with the artifacts, but I think one could, given the fact that they are archaeologically associated, and those early microblade traditions that I showed earlier from Swan Point, but they're also from the Upper Sun River site, the Little John site in the Yukon Territory, and a number of other sites in the interior date very early, 13,000, 14,000 years ago. And this Northeast Asian microblade technology characterizes all of these sites in some way, form, or another, and there's a lot of nuances, and I don't know if we want to get into all of that, but I think it would be, if you did technologically relate the genes to the artifacts, that would be the most close relationship. So it would be the early Eurasian microblade complexes of eastern Beringia. Very different. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you first.
And so that would be very different, I think, than what we're beginning to glimpse on the northwest coast. Although I will say that there are microblades on the northwest coast, and it's not entirely clear how far back in time they go, how old they are.
It's a fascinating issue, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's also been suggested that because the microblades are very important in high latitude adaptations in terms of conserving lithic material, particularly in the winter when everything is frozen and you can't get, replenish your tool stone and so forth, that as people move south, they just drop microblades from their toolkit. It's another possible option.
Thank you.
Sure.
This is Ann Hitchcock. This isn't directly about archaeology, but in the maps that you showed, in the area of Manitoba, there was a lake called Glacial Lake Agassiz, and I saw on the maps that you showed, I saw the Lake Manitoba and Lake Winnipeg, which are there now, and they seem to be there in some form, but I didn't see Glacial Lake Agassiz, and why wouldn't it have been represented in one of the periods that you had on your map? It was a huge area.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I just left it out because I was focusing on the northern part of this, really from the southern terminus of the deglaciation corridor. Oh. But if I were to extend this further south, yes, it definitely should be there.
Okay, sure. Thanks.
So it wasn't by the fact that I was pretending it didn't exist. I just had to stop it somewhere.
Right. Thank you.
Sure.
Great talk. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
I have a question. This is Amanda Johnson Campbell. I'm calling from Hawaii. Thank you so much. This was a really great talk. And I'm wondering, is there any evidence for or study being done on the actual watercraft that would have been used?
Well, there really isn't, and that's the extreme skeptics. That's what they always bring up is well, unless you find a boat, it's we're not going to believe it. The chances of finding some kind of, it wouldn't have to be a boat, it could even be a raft or some type of watercraft. The chances of finding something like that are very slim. It's possible that there could be some examples in the muds on the continental shelf and so forth, but I think the inferential evidence is overwhelming with the occurrence of obsidian, quartz crystal, these types of exotic rocks on these islands, lithic types, that people had to transport them there, and they could only do that with watercraft. And of course, the fact that they themselves were there requires watercraft. So I think that's a bogus argument. In terms of the watercraft themselves, I wouldn't be at all surprised if we're not looking at skin boats here of some type. These are very, well adapted for sea ice conditions, easily manufactured in areas where there's small wood supplies and so forth. And they appear to have a long history in the Beringian archaeological record anyway. We know that people use watercraft. We have in northern Japan and areas of the Amur River area and so forth for 20,000 years at least, because we have archaeological remains on these islands. So there's good evidence from Asia. But the actual type of watercraft is a very good question. If I had to guess, I would guess skin boats, but it could be a variety of other types as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
This is Michael Foddy again. I just wanted to add that while you can't find the boats all the time, there's more evidence of tools that are used to make those boats, and that can be a way we can track them down as well.
Yeah, very good point. Good point. In fact, I think that Dennis Stanford believes he has some of these types of artifacts in very early sites on the east coast of North America as well.
Yeah, good point.
This is Ann Hitchcock again. Does the oral tradition in the Northwest Coast Native communities relate to the theories that you've presented here, the evidence that you've presented about where they came from and so forth?
Well, that's a very good question, and I've worked very closely with the Tlingit people who live in this area, and many of them participated in the excavations and in even some of the publications. Yes, there is an oral history that describes people moving about the sea level getting higher every year. So people had to keep moving higher and higher and higher and back from the ocean as sea level rose. And, of course, there's no firm dates from this, but when we would do the archaeology and the geology, people would say, "Oh, that's when that happened." They liked the research because they could fit it into the oral history. It would give a year chronology, and so that to them I think was very valuable, and it was complementary to their knowledge. In terms of ancient movements of people long ago, that's a different story because there are many groups and they have different. They moved around a lot, so it's hard to tell at what time period some of these stories, histories, are set. So that's a little trickier. I found that much trickier.
Interesting. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's fascinating. But I will say one thing on that topic, that when the human remains were discovered, the people there were very curious, and they fully accepted this individual as an ancestor. It wasn't like, well, could it be, some other type of person or group of people, and the dietary information from the isotope analysis was very important because for them it demonstrated a long history of the use of marine resources, which are very important today, and of course are contentious in terms of commercial fisheries and traditional subsistence rights and so forth. So it's been a fascinating experience.
Jim, would you care to comment on how people might have made their way around the Aleutians if they're working their way down the coast? It seems like that would have been a pretty formidable set of almost continuous islands, or I guess it would be a pretty continuous peninsula at that time.
Well, it's a good question. The archaeological evidence, at least as we know it now, is that the Aleutian Islands were colonized from the east to the west. So people from the Alaska Peninsula moved out on actually some of the nearest Aleutian Islands were part of the Alaska Peninsula during the late Pleistocene and then early Holocene, and then and that area was occupied, and then people moved westward along the island chain. It's about 1,000 miles long, westward, and the archaeological sites, at least based on the ones we've discovered and been able to date, suggest that they get younger and younger the further west you get. So if this coastal migration model is correct, then people would have come along the southern margins of the Bering Land Bridge until they came to the Alaska Peninsula, and then slowly migrated out along the Aleutian Island chain from there. If all these data prove to be correct, and of course, what we don't know is just phenomenal compared to what little we do know.
Yes, of course. Given that all these folks are hunter-gatherers, it doesn't seem like you can point to population as a mechanism for pushing colonization of the New World. And it seems more likely that they're following mobile herds of animals. Have there been any attempts to model population growth among like bison or caribou?
Well, I don't know about that. I think there's two different scenarios here. One is, the terrestrial migration or movement of people across the Bering Land Bridge, and this probably happened. And we have good evidence of these microblade traditions in Northeast Asia and then in Alaska and Yukon, 14,000 years ago. Then, but there may be something very different happening, and these would be terrestrial land mammal hunters primarily and fishers. But along the coast, it may have been a very different kind of scenario, particularly the northwest coast and the Gulf of Alaska, because now we're dealing with a very narrow, relatively narrow, even though it's really quite broad, strip of land that's bordered on ice by one side and the ocean by the other. And so I'm not sure that population pressure wouldn't have been a factor in this, and it would have forced movement unidirectionally in a very kind of tight corridor, biotic corridor, what John Arlenson would call the Kelp Highway, and it would have been first westward and then southward. So I think there might be different models there. In terms of actually modeling human dispersal in terms of herding animals, I think there has been some work done on this, but it's not my area of expertise. Sorry.
Very interesting, though. I have one last question for you. What would you predict, or what do you think submerged sites might look like? Like if we are going to start thinking about or start proposing research to look for sites on the continent, the submerged portions of the continental shelf, what are we looking for? Are we looking for open air sites? Is there any likelihood of cave sites, like the cave sites that we're seeing along the coast now? Are we looking for fish weirs? What would you predict, or what would you think is going to be our most profitable or likely place to look for sites?
Well, I think that's a great question, and Michael Foth, who's online here, is one of the pioneers in this. So it's great he's here. He can pipe in too. But I think a lot of us recognize the continental shelves as really the next big frontier in North American archaeology, geographic frontier. And what's out there is really, I would expect it's going to be an extension of a lot of things we see on land. I'm sure there'll be We know there are submerged caves and rock shelters, certainly a possibility. There's a number of us who've done various modeling and other types of ways to identify likely site locales on the continental shelves. This work is all in its infancy. And for example, Clinton Mackey and Dale Fedge and others have been looking for fish weirs, evidence of fish weirs along the coast of British Columbia. I was looking for habitation sites off the coast of southeast Alaska. I think Michael has been looking for habitation sites as well, following river channels seaward. But Michael, you should pipe in on this, but in the Gulf of Mexico and so forth. So, yeah, I think we'll see a wide variety of sites, and we could see some of things like shell middens submerged and other things as well.
Yeah, this is Fuad. I couldn't agree more. The notion that it's a terrestrial analog we're looking for the kinds of places, the landscapes that we're familiar with for sites is a way to go. It's definitely localized or to different areas, so that the Northwest Coast is certainly different than Southern California, is different than the Gulf of Mexico, and so on and so forth. So each area has its own particular things, but it's for sure that Dixon's work up in the Northwest Coast, along with Monteleone, is ex-student, and the Canadians it's cutting edge, absolutely, and in the right place to look for this coastal migration. There can be no doubt.
Wow, thanks for that commentary. And I wanted to add that Michael's going to talk in this series later in the year, I think in January. So we're looking forward to your talk as well.
Oh, that would be great.
I just have to put it together.
We'll get started. Do we have any more questions or comments for our speaker? Well, no? Well, don't forget that we have a talk next week. And I want to thank Dr. Dixon very much for such an interesting and stimulating talk today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank all of you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay.
Whoop.
Hello?
Yes, Karen, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I thought I hung up by accident.
Jim, that was an excellent talk.
Oh, well, good. I thought it was a little disjointed, but it's hard to do it without seeing people's faces. I found that difficult.
Very true. I have approached people who've refused to speak in this series because they need the feedback from the audience. I think it takes a special kind of speaker to be able to do this, someone with a very, strong discipline and an iron will.
Well, I don't know about that, but we muddled through in spite of our technological, I'm so disappointed. I apologize for the technological breakdown. The one thing I didn't factor in